I'm excited to do my third episode and excited to have you, Ken, joining to talk about accessibility because you and I have had plenty of conversations about accessibility. And I think us going back and forth and covering some topics that maybe don't get covered publicly very often could be very cool. And so I'm excited to have you joining today and sharing, and I'm excited to see where the conversation goes. But let's start with you introducing yourself and letting everyone know who Ken is.
Sure. So my name is Ken Nakata, and I've been around in digital accessibility for a while. I'm coming up on my sixth decade in age. I've been working in accessibility for a little over 30 years. I started at the Justice Department, working in the disability rights section. I was one of the first attorneys there. And I worked originally in built environment accessibility. And then during the second half of my career, I transitioned over to digital accessibility when Section 508 was passed. And so in the early days of Section 508, I was helping the federal government implement its policy. I was coordinating on behalf of the Justice Department, uh, lots of legal issues around digital accessibility. I helped the Access Board develop its original Section 508 regulation, and I put on my techie hat and helped create the guide to designing accessible web pages. And then after I left the Justice Department, I moved to Seattle, and I've been out here ever since, working as a consultant in digital accessibility, but also recently getting back more into my original roots of built environment accessibility. And I think that overlap between the two is really cool right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Ken and I think we've been on Wednesday calls consecutively, the WebAlign call every Wednesday for almost 2 years now. We've been talking and discussing different areas as I'm working on websites, trying to make them more accessible. You and Jeff are working on projects asking for user feedback and user experience. I've learned so much from you and Jeff together, whether that's specific to the website I'm working on at the time or just understanding a specific concept or success criteria or whatever that looks like. And so I want to start the conversation with the Converge Accessibility tool and letting everybody know what that tool is, what it does, who it's meant for. And then I want to circle back and get into some of the specifics of your original roots and how that ties into the digital landscape a little bit. So WebAlign, phenomenal tool. I've been using it since we met. And now a lot of the students that I'm teaching and training on accessibility are also using it. So why don't you let everyone know what WebAlign is and who it's designed for?
Yeah, well, actually, would you mind if I start in by discussing why we created it?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
Okay, yeah, so the why is, well, we originally created it for ourselves. And it grew out of a project that Jeff and I worked on for a different company, and we saw the potential in this kind of model. And we said, oh my God, this is exactly what we need for ourselves. When we look at the WCAG success criteria, it's clearly written for academics by academics, and there's a certain level of abstraction to many of the concepts. And that abstraction is intended to cover lots of different scenarios. And a classic one that I always point to is success criteria 1.3.1, information and relationships, because the 16 words that go into that success criteria don't really say that much about what specific kinds of things it's covering. So it basically says that information and relationships that are conveyed through the visual layout have to be conveyed programmatically as well. And when you hear those, it sounds like a perfectly good concept, but what the heck does that mean?
Right.
And so we looked at all the different techniques and tried to put some structure around it, because otherwise what we were seeing is that a lot of other consultants were throwing basically anything that they couldn't figure out, and if it wasn't making perfect sense with the screen reader, they just throw onto 1.3.1. And that didn't have enough granularity to it. And so we thought we really needed to say, okay, it really comes down to things like the header structure has to be correct, that um, things like the different regions in a web page have to be identified. Um, Things like that go into information and relationships, and those are illustrated in things like the techniques. And so we thought, it really makes sense to look through all those techniques and scrub them really well, and think of some other instances where information and relationships come up and categorize them. And so that's, I think, what we really the goal of WebAlign was to take the abstraction that they built into the WCAG and try to bring it down to something that is much more concrete and something that people could actually use. So they can say, oh, yes, the header structure is off. And the one thing that they'll go to is, oh, that's 1.3.1, obviously, because we created a special category for that. So you know exactly where to pigeonhole all of these things. And what we found is that in our own testing work, that it's really essential to do that for ourselves, because sometimes things don't fall into exactly one category or another. There might be there's a bit of gray area, but by really trying to make concrete what each success criteria is getting at and the different techniques and things like that that go into each one, it's much easier to say, oh no, it falls under this success criteria and not this other one. So that's the goal was to create a WCAG test reports in a more repeatable way, so that if two testers look at the same web page, that they'll end up getting the same results. To make it clearer, so that people could learn WCAG more easily, to conceptualize the overall structure in their mind, because otherwise it becomes a big amorphous bunch of goo. And so and so in that sense, it's really intended for anybody who touches websites. And we love feedback on, why we thought about putting things into different success criteria. And if people have feedback in terms of, this idea really there's another concept that you need to add. Well, okay, yeah. Sometimes we've added what we call core concepts based upon feedback that we've gotten.
Yeah.
So yeah, it makes it a lot more granular. And I think that ultimately, when WCAG 3.0 comes out, I think that it's all those concepts that are the key to accessibility. And how those concepts get translated is into WCAG is just just an exercise in which category or bucket they fall in.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's very adaptable.
The core concepts, the knowledge base, like there's even inside of WebAlign automated tools or bookmarklets or things you can get your hands on to help with accessibility testing. I used it a lot when I was trying to just make sense of all of this stuff. And so like the way it's laid out, it's when you get into those core concepts, it starts to break it down into what type of role or responsibility do you play in the accessibility conversation. So walk us through how you guys came up with the different tabs that are inside of those core concepts that pertain to developers and QA testers, and the different roles that are impacted by that specific success criteria or that technique.
Yeah, that's a great point, James. So with WebAlign, we realized that so much of web accessibility comes down to the user interface and user experience. And that ultimately it goes far beyond just the role of the developer. The developer, sure, is the guy who fixes it once you found all the problems, but there's so many things in web accessibility that are really at the UX or wireframe design stage. And that early stages, the copy authors, the graphics design people, they all have a critical role to play. in making stuff accessible. And each of the core concepts ultimately comes down to everybody being involved in the process. So that example, for instance, of header structure, for instance, sure, a developer can go in and add the right H1 and H2 and H3 tags to make certain elements into headers. But ultimately, that structure is copy. It's text, right? And
Right.
so if it's text, that's somebody, the copy author is the guy who's laying out that text,
Yeah,
whether he's
determining
doing it
what
in
sections there are within the page or the document.
exactly right. So if that is the person who should be thinking about header structure first, and then once that person, the copy author says, okay, well, this should be a higher level heading than this other heading. Well, okay, that one's an H1, this one's an H2. Then that copy indicates what the header level is. So though if it gets passed off to a developer, they know exactly what they have to do. So and similarly like graphics, for instance, like how many times do we see um, graphics that are created with Canva or Adobe Express that use text on images or that have complicated graphics where you have to have where you have to be able to discern elements in that graphic. You've got color contrast issues all over that, and that's WCAG. And so the graphics person needs to suddenly worry about color contrast. Well, make sure those things meet color contrast requirements. When you hand it off to the developer, they're not going to be able to do anything with that. They're going to hand it back to you. So everybody has a role to play. And so what we did was for each of the core concepts, we nailed down what people have to do that are early in the process, what we call the pre-production, copy authors, UX designers, graphic artists. What do they have to do? And then what does the code look like? That's for the developer that's a separate tab. And then the third tab is what do the testers test? How do they test for it? And in that last part, for the test part, we realized that most people don't use assistive technology well, especially me. I'm horrible at it. And so we were very careful to come up with a set of tools that are free, that are available on the web, and they're always being updated too, to reflect what are the tools that people can use to objectively test whether that core concept is being met or not. So ultimately, you don't need assistive technology in order to test or to do any of this, which is ultimately a good thing because most people don't use assistive technology very well.
Right. And then that's one of the components that I love about WebAlign is when I'm doing trainings or consulting, when I'm teaching people about accessibility, it makes it very easy for me to convey. I have a room full of 25 people. Some are designers, some are developers, some are content creators, some are management, leadership, some are testers. It makes it very easy to look and talk to each one of those groups instead of it being a very broad statement of um, magnification can be increased to 400% without introducing two axes of scrolling. Okay, what do we do about that? Whose problem is that? Who needs to worry about that? It makes it very easy to have those conversations to tell people if you are a designer, this is something you need to have on your radar, and you guys have those checklists that are specific to those different roles and responsibilities that makes it just even easier. And so I'm curious if you agree with this. I was at a UX conference back in October, and I included this in one of my presentations that 80% of accessibility issues can be fixed by designers.
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that
Your Figma people, your wireframers, your prototypers, your designers, your UX researchers. I think majority of accessibility actually falls on them more than it does the developer.
yeah, I think so. If the UX designer knows about accessibility and can convey to the developer things like predicted behavior or the state of an object or what kind of object it is, then it makes it much easier for the developer to, if say for instance it's a tab control or an accordion control or something like that, um, that the information about things like role equals expanded and things like that, um, that information conveyed through notes on a wireframe is makes the developer role much clearer in terms of, okay, this is how I have to code it.
Yeah. Well, and from a developer's perspective, how many that you work with a lot of organizations, how many developers use ARIA without knowing that that's what they're using it for
Uh,
things like tab index or different instances like that where they are doing it out of just habit or repeated behavior without even realizing that a lot of the stuff that we're doing because it doesn't quite look right or it needs to have this because that's how I've always done it. How much of that it is accessibility and how much of accessibility on the other side is intention more so
yeah, so
than anything
I'll
else.
answer that in a different way. I'll say that, yeah, a lot of developers, I think, just do it out of habit, or they might not know exactly why it is that they're doing it. When, but then again, it's ultimately UX professionals, their profession is based around the user experience. That's kind of by definition what their job title is. And it's when the lights go on in the room, I think, is when they realize a lot of our users are users with disabilities. And their experience when they're using a screen reader is just as valid of a user experience as a sighted user when they're looking at a web page and seeing a tab control behave in a certain way, or when an accordion control behaves in a certain way. And so when the UX designer starts thinking in terms of how are users with disabilities going to interact with this? What are they going to hear or sense if they're using a braille display? How are they going to experience what they're consuming? And that user experience is conveyed to the developer by saying, okay, these are the things that we expect based upon the behavior. And then I think, yeah, that's when I think we start having a meaningful conversation. Then the developer asks, oh, why did you do that? Well, because I want my users who are using screen readers to be able to experience or consume this data in this way. And so, oh, okay, then that makes sense. And then that's the reason why I'm doing this. Yeah, absolutely. But it does require UX designers, I think, to have a closer appreciation of what the technological limitations are. What does the ARIA spec say? And it says this. Well, why does it say that? Because we want users to experience something in a certain way. Okay, that's the reason. So I just have to tell the developer that they have to do those things. So, yeah.
So let me ask you this question. What percent of people are intentionally not incorporating accessibility versus what percent of people are just unconscious or unaware that accessibility should be a part of the process?
Oh, I'd say most people are, almost everybody. I don't think people actually intentionally try to exclude people with disabilities. I think that they just think that it's such a, well, either they don't really care because it interferes with the things that they already know, or which I would say they're in the minority, or the folks that just they care, but they just don't, it's not something that's on their
They,
radar because nobody's demanded it.
they don't
I think
think
they're the majority.
they don't think that they have a customer who's blind or visually impaired trying to get their phone number on their website or trying to check out online or that's been the majority of my experience is that they
Hmm.
don't believe that they have customers with disabilities. And
Yeah,
then
I think that's right.
until they're aware that like me, you're sitting across the table from me, I've purchased from you before. I didn't tell you that I had a visual impairment. I didn't tell you that I was legally blind. I just figured out how to make it work. I'm different than everybody else with a disability, you can't assume that I'm just going to figure out how to make it work and everybody else is going to take that same approach.
Yeah.
When I start to get into that conversation, that's where the light bulb goes off, where people are like, man, how many people have I turned away? How many people have gone to my competitor? How many people have gone somewhere else, asked somebody for help because I wasn't even aware, I wasn't thinking in this way until just now.
Yeah.
And I've talked to companies that have been around for 100+ years, and 2024 is the first time that they're even talking about accessibility. And
Yeah.
so I think I tried to get a percentage out of you, but I think it's like, I would say probably 96% of people aren't purposefully or intentionally being inaccessible. It's a lack of awareness.
Okay, so you need a number out of me, huh? Well, yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I'd say it's quite that high. But yeah, I'd say it's somewhere in the 80 to 90% range. Are yeah, blithely go along their day without thinking about how a person with a disability is going to access their content.
The example that I love to use is myself. I'm not necessarily the ideal customer of, say, a car dealership because I'm legally blind. I don't drive. But what about when I have a child that's turning 16 and getting ready to have their license? Who's going to help make that purchase?
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
right.
That's
Yeah,
my favorite example to throw out to people because it gets them to think about not just their direct consumer, but all of the people who influence or assist in that buying process. My marketing brain can't shut off. I have to think in that way of, this person isn't making that decision by themselves. There's been their entire life worth of influences leading them into choosing me versus the guy next door, or even wanting or feeling like they need my product or service. The experience, the accessibility of my product or service should not be the thing that turns them away.
yes, that's
If
right.
I can't get on your website and research different car models and years and specs and features, I'm going to go to a different dealership. You're
Yeah,
never going to know that I was on there, had a bad experience, and went somewhere else.
yeah,
Uh, and that's just the way it is.
yeah,
There's no inside of your Google Analytics, it's not going to tell you if the person on your website was using a screen reader or a braille display, or they magnified to 400%, or they had high contrast mode. It's not going to tell you any of that. It's up to you as the organization to just build that in so that it's not even a guess. It's not even a question why people are leaving the site. Is it because we're not accessible? We know it. We know it's accessible, so that's not a reason we have to worry about.
hmm, yep,
Um, so
yeah,
I want to transition to your original background because I think we are kind of at the peak of where your tech hat transition and your original background are merging together, where we're seeing a lot of physical spaces transitioning to the digital world. We saw a tremendous spike of it in 2020 with the pandemic. Everybody went home to work. But now we're a couple of years removed from that. People are still working from home. People are shopping online more and more. Business storefronts are shutting down locations because it's easier to just have one warehouse and ship internationally from your warehouse. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on where that world is headed, but also why you have started to go back to that original root of the physical space accessibility.
yeah. So that's a great question too. Um, it's not because I sought it out. It's seeking me out. Um, let's see. So the people who work on digital accessibility tend to be, in any organization, tend not to be the typical ADA person. It tends to be more of the techies. And sometimes, if you're talking about Section 508, which is slightly different, then you're talking about the techies and the procurement people. But you don't typically get the the real accessibility advocates, except maybe some people from the blind community, you don't get them in the same room um, as those techies in when it comes to digital accessibility. In the built environment, by contrast, oh my gosh, it's just completely different. You obviously have no techies and you have no procurement people. It's all, you get some architects, but you also get a ton of people with disabilities, a ton of people from the space, the physical mobility space. And I think that's a huge portion of the people with disabilities. And it's also the most visible, I think, element of the people with disabilities in terms of what the average person thinks of as a person with a disability. I think most people think of, gosh, I think of a person who uses a wheelchair instead of a deaf person first. It's just sensory disabilities are slightly more invisible, so to speak, than a physical disability. And so,
Right.
anyways, it's the needs are different, the technologies are different, but in the traditional built environment world under Title II, organizations are supposed to occasionally do these things called self-evaluations. And they're supposed to look at how they're delivering all their programs, services, and activities and ask themselves whether anything is creating a barrier for people with disabilities. And recently, they've realized, oh, well, one of the ways we're providing our services is digitally. And in fact, it's more and more digitally. Maybe we should start thinking about incorporating digital accessibility into our traditional Title II self-evaluations. And so we've been seeing more and more and more of that. Well, and this is actually something that's fairly common that most people don't think about when it comes to digital accessibility. State and local governments are doing this all the time. They're always issuing RFPs, and they're pretty expensive RFPs. Like some of them are several $100,000. Like they just did one up here in King County Metro, where they basically looked at every bus station and every park and ride and every,
Yeah.
parking lot, right? And they look at it for terms of physical accessibility. Well, now they're also starting to look at that and say, oh gosh, well, what about that? What about the fare machines? What about, the website for being able to figure out where I'm going to go on my park and ride? Things like that. All of a sudden, people are realizing that's part of the program. So digital accessibility is creeping in that way. And so that's one way. And then the other thing is obviously, that this, even though the Title II regulation just came out and it was developed fairly quickly for web accessibility, there's always been movement towards that.
Right.
And people have known that it's always coming. And so now organizations are thinking in terms of digital accessibility more and more. And then organization in the private sector, you know, they've always known about that they have I think private companies have always known that they have physical accessibility requirements. So just as much as like 80 to 90% of people, like we said before, probably don't have any clue about, digital accessibility. If you're a business owner, you probably know you've got to make your building accessible if you're a place of public accommodation. You just know that because, otherwise you got to know, you have to provide some accessible parking spaces and you're going to gripe about having to do it, but you have to do it because that's what the ADA requires. Um, Now with all the lawsuits that are happening, they're realizing, oh yeah, now if I want to avoid getting sued, I've got to make my website accessible. Well, maybe we should think about it in terms of more holistically, like how is everything we're doing in terms of accessibility? So that's
And
another way it's coming about.
we did our webinar a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things we talked about was the maturity model. And I
Mhm.
think that I don't know how much you've looked into it, but I think that is one of those evidence pieces that is the way organizations that have those physical buildings and the digital landscapes are starting to try to piece that together, is with those models of, okay, our physical space is accessible, it's optimized, it's maintained. Now let's look at our digital. We're in the planning phase, we're in the implementation phase, we're in the optimize or the maintain phase. I think the digital world is starting to see that process kind of happen. And I think from a general user perspective, a lot of us don't think about the physical world accessibility being as prevalent of an issue as it actually is, because we go through our day-to-days and we don't even realize all of these accessibility features that we encounter or that we experience until we go somewhere that doesn't have them.
Yeah.
You go somewhere and you have a phenomenal experience, and it's, wow, I had a really great time there. We don't really take the time to sit back and think, what made that a great time? Was it more convenient? Was it faster? Was it easier? Was it less of a cognitive load? Was it less physically demanding? All of that is exactly what those architects that you're working with are thinking about and trying to do. So they're, in a sense, the equivalent of that UX engineer or researcher, because they're optimizing the physical spaces that we visit, while the UX people or the designers or the content authors are optimizing our online experiences. So I think there's almost a one-to-one correlation in terms of job titles and roles and responsibilities between that physical and that online world now. And it's cool to be in the time period where all of that bridging is happening.
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
people say
Yes.
we're not even close to being done yet, and everybody likes to look at it from a glass half empty perspective. But I think you'll agree with me that we've come a pretty significant way, even in the last 4 years, let alone the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, but I still think that well, yeah, there's a huge distance to go though. We still have to get
Yeah.
to that
Oh,
that
of
80 to
course.
90%. You say 90, I say 80. But yeah, that 80 to 90% of people that haven't that the awareness hasn't caught on. And I think that a large part of that, I think, isn't so much a technological conversation. It's more of a personal conversation. I mean, I can talk about digital accessibility, but it might not. When I talk about it, I either have to talk about it to the people who have already gotten it, or the people that are more concerned about things like objective business risk and things like that.
Right.
But I think the more effective conversation is when it happens on a more of a personal level. Because most people, I believe that most people don't know people with disabilities. They've never had a close friend that has a
Yeah.
disability.
They don't think they
Um,
exist. They don't think
yeah,
we
or
exist.
or
Yeah.
if they do exist, they can't imagine how they live their lives. I mean, I don't mean to sound too um, too much of a bigot or anything, but I think that most people think that blind people just sit around a dark room and listen to the radio all day. I mean, it's just, they don't think about that they actually live a life. They actually participate in society. They actually have a job. They shop. They raise kids. They do all these things. I don't think that they think that they do that, or they can't imagine how they do it. And if they had a friend, if they knew somebody with a disability that that they see that's going through their day-to-day lives with, then I think that's when they realize, oh, these little choices about things like, oh, I'm just popping an image on a web page. Oh,
No,
yeah,
the
that
alt
does
text
make a
is
difference.
optional.
Yeah,
Yeah.
alt text suddenly doesn't become optional. It becomes required. Yeah, yeah. So, anyways,
Yeah. And there's so much to this conversation, which is the whole reason I'm doing these videos and these interviews, because I talk to Mike Hess and we talk about employment and what are employers looking for, because some of them are saying open to hiring diverse talent, but then when you disclose that you have a disability, you're automatically thrown out of the list. I talked to Matt Filipinko. What is
hmm
Microsoft doing to increase and make it easier to produce accessible content through the Microsoft products and services? We're talking about that gap between physical and digital, and so there's so many of these conversations to have, and I'm fortunate I get to have these every Wednesday with you and Ken and Greg and some of the other guys that jump in and out. But there's so much to it, and I think it becomes overwhelming until you start to chunk it out and make it make sense to their daily activities. What is your job where that you're spending 8 hours on? What about outside of that? What are you doing are you leaving your cart in the middle of the aisle and making it a hazard? So I think there's a lot to absorb and a lot to soak in and a lot to sort of digest when it comes to this whole accessibility conversation, and it is overwhelming. I've been there. I at one point in my life didn't even like telling people that I had a visual impairment, and now it's
Mhm.
the forefront of who I am as a person. And so um, I'm just excited to keep having these conversations. And so I want to be mindful of your time and the people watching. So if somebody wants to connect with you or Jeff or look into WebAlign, they want to have a conversation with you about that bridge between the digital and the physical world. What's the best way for people to get a hold of Ken?
Well, the easiest to remember is just our website, convergeaccessibility.com. And just go there. And, if you need to contact us, if you want to contact us and reach out to us, there's plenty of links on that webpage, on the webpage, that'll tell you how to get there and how to get to one of us. It won't give you our direct email address. Instead, it'll give you a Calendly link and you can just chat with us. Um, but my email address is ken.nakata at convergeaccessibility.com. Um, Before we end, I thought that one thing that, while we're having this conversation, one thing that occurs to me is that I think one of the things that's been a issue for between the physical environment accessibility and the digital environment accessibility, again, comes down to the differences in the types of disabilities that we're talking about. And, one very interesting conversation that you can have with someone else, but I think would be really interesting is the awareness of disability needs between different groups of people with disabilities. Because I don't think people with mobility impairments really think in terms of, gosh, all text on images. They don't think of that as really I don't think that most of them even are. I think that they would be, if you look at people with physical disabilities and you surveyed them, if you could somehow do that, and you ask them about their awareness about digital accessibility, I'd say it's maybe 5% greater than the general population. And it's just not on their radar. And similarly, I think that most people with, um, well, a lot of people who have visual impairments, I don't know whether they think, oh, in terms of like, oh, 32-inch doorways or 1 in 12 ramps or things like that.
Right.
It's just,
It's
it's,
almost like it's no pun intended, tunnel vision based on their own lived experiences.
yes, exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. Because,
absolutely. And I literally just got done teaching before this, but one of the things I emphasize as I'm covering WCAG, Universal Design for Learning, is the broadening of the perspective of your experience. Nobody can tell you otherwise about your own experience. But if you're going to get into the accessibility space, if you're going to become a tester or an engineer or anything to do with accessibility, you have to be able to think about other people.
yes,
But
and you
when
have to
you,
be able to think about other people with disabilities.
yeah, and so for me, when I sit down and test a website, my default is I'm going to zoom into whatever feels comfortable for me. If the color contrast is bad, those are the easy ones when I'm
Hmm.
testing a website because they actually affect me. But I always have to pull myself back and say, okay, I'm going to unplug my mouse and force myself to try to use the website with just a keyboard. Or I'm going to turn the sound off on the video and read the captions and see if they go too fast or they go too slow, if they provide enough information or not enough information. So I actually like in some cases I will put myself in those scenarios. When it comes to screen reader testing, I will stop looking at the screen because
Yeah.
I want to create as true of an experience as possible when I'm giving someone feedback on because they have to count on me. They have to trust what I'm telling them about the accessibility. If I
Yes,
don't tell
exactly.
them, nobody else is going to,
Right.
unless
And it's
somebody.
difficult for you to do, but to imagine the difficulty for your students it's even, or the people that your clients, it's hard enough for them to get for the lights to go on in the room in terms of, oh
Oh,
gosh, somebody with a
absolutely.
visual impairment, what about all those other disabilities? And what about like this conversation about digital accessibility and the built environment, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to suddenly make their bathrooms accessible if they suddenly make their website accessible.
No, and to me, that's the most rewarding part about being in the accessibility space, doing roundtables and lunch and learns and trainings and consulting is when that light bulb moment happens, it's like the whole world opens up.
Yes.
Like I always tell my students in our first week, you're welcome, but by the end of this class, you're never going to be able to go shop online without thinking about the accessibility of the website ever again.
Yeah.
I'm giving you a gift and a curse at the same time, because anytime you check out, you're going to see, is error prevention a thing? Do I get to check review, or is my submission automatically checked against internal databases and validation? Like, you're going to think about all of this as you're going through your experience from here on out. And so you're welcome for that, but I also apologize. So it's a fun space to be in. It's constantly changing and growing. We're constantly getting updates and changes. You've gotten to see a lot more of them than I have. I'm still what did you call me at the beginning? My young glow is
Oh, you are Brother Dawn.
Brother
Yes,
Don.
and I am Brother Dusk.
I'm excited to see where this goes as I get older, as my vision progresses and gets worse. I'm excited to be here and hopefully be in the forefront of the conversations, pushing things faster and better and further along. And
Yeah,
so one of the ways we're doing that is having these conversations. Um,
yeah.
so
It's an exciting time to be in this field. That's for darn sure.
it's all about the conversations and the awareness and the intention, and I'm being intentional about these conversations to raise that awareness. And so I
Yes.
appreciate you for jumping on, having a conversation with me. We'll get Jeff next time, and get his point of view on WebAlign and what direction he thinks things are going in. And it will be curious because you two, everyone I talk to, Jeff and Ken are the guys in accessibility. And
Oh,
so
well, thank you.
I'm super excited to have you guys on here, willing to have conversations and let me record it and put it out there publicly. Just you guys have done a lot for me. You've done a lot for a lot of other people. And so I'm excited to hopefully push you guys in front of more people.
Oh, well, thanks. I appreciate that. Well, we appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it. We'll probably have to do a part two to talk more about the legal side of things because we didn't really get to that with our conversation, but we can figure that out elsewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be cool. I mean, especially with all the things that have been going on. Um, Justice says that they're going to come out with a Title III reg, but I don't think they are. Or if they do, I think that would be kind of dangerous. That would be that's kind of dangerous for
If you
totally
want to,
different reasons.
if you want to stay up to date with the legal stuff, subscribe to the Converge Accessibility blog because the legal update emails are one of the main ways I get my information. So,
Yeah,
awesome.
well, thanks.
Well, thank you, Ken. I appreciate it. And we'll get Jeff next time and keep it moving, keep having
Okay.
conversations.